Story 5 of Buttered Side Down. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Madeira. Buttered Side Down by Edna Ferber. Story 5. The Kitchen Side of the Door. The city was celebrating New Year's Eve. Spelled thus, with a capital C, no it can mean but New York. In the pink fountain room of the newest hotel, all those grand old forms and customs handed down to us for the occasion were being rigidly observed in all their original quaintness. The Van Dyked man who looked like a Russian Grand Duke (he really was a chiropodist) had drunk champagne out of the pink satin slipper of the lady who behaved like an actress. She was forelady at Schmaus's Wholesale Millinery, 8th floor. The two respectable married ladies, there in the corner, had been kissed by each other's husbands. The slim, Puritan-faced woman in white, with her black hair so demurely parted and coiled in a sleek knot, had risen suddenly from her place and walked indolently to the edge of the plashing pink fountain in the center of the room, had stood contemplating its shallows with a dreamy half-smile on her lips, and then had lifted her slim legs slowly and gracefully over its fern-fringed basin, and had waded into its chilling midst, trailing her exquisite white satin and chiffon draperies after her, and scaring the goldfish into fits. The loudest scream of approbation had come from the yellow-haired, loose-lipped youth who had made the wager and lost it. The heavy blonde in the inevitable violet draperies showed signs of wanting to dance on the table. Her companion, a structure made up of layer upon layer and fold upon fold of flabby tissue, knew all the waiters by their right names and insisted on singing with the orchestra and beating time with a rye roll. The clatter of dishes was giving way to the clink of glasses. In the big, bright kitchen back of the pink fountain room, Miss Gussie Fink sat at her desk, calm, watchful, insolent-eyed, a goddess sitting in judgment. On the payroll of the newest hotel, Miss Gussie Fink's name appeared as kitchen checker, but her regular job was goddessing. Her altar was a high desk in a corner of the busy kitchen, and it was an altar of incense, of burnt offerings, and of showbread. Inexorable as a goddess of the ancients was Miss Fink, and 10 times as difficult to appease. For this is the rule of the newest hotel: that no waiter may carry his laden tray restaurantward until its contents have been viewed and duly checked by the eye and hand of Miss Gussie Fink or her assistants. Flat upon the table must go every tray, off must go each silver dish cover, lifted must be each napkin to disclose its treasure of steaming corn or hot rolls. Clouds of incense rose before Miss Gussie Fink, and she sniffed it unmoved, her eyes beneath level brows regarding savory broiler or cunning ice with equal indifference, appraising alike lobster cocktail or onion soup, traveling from Blue Points to Brie. Things a la and things glacé were all one to her. Gazing at food was Miss Gussie Fink's occupation, and just to see the way she regarded a boneless squab made you certain that she never ate. In spite of the I don't know how many (see ads) New Year's Eve diners for whom food was provided that night, the big, busy kitchen was the most orderly, shining, spotless place imaginable. But Miss Gussie Fink was the neatest, most immaculate object in all that great, clean room. There was that about her which suggested daisies in a field, if you know what I mean. This may have been due to the fact that her eyes were brown while her hair was gold, or it may have been something about the way her collars fitted high and tight and smooth, or the way her close white sleeves came down to meet her pretty hands, or the way her shining hair sprung from her forehead. Also the smooth creaminess of her skin may have had something to do with it, but privately I think it was due to the way she wore her shirtwaists. Miss Gussie Fink could wear a starched white shirtwaist under a close-fitting winter coat, remove the coat, run her right forefinger along her collar's edge and her left thumb along the back of her belt, and disclose to the admiring world a blouse as unwrinkled and unsullied as though it had just come from her own skillful hands at the ironing board. Miss Gussie Fink was so innately, flagrantly, beautifully clean-looking that, well, there must be a stop to this description. She was the kind of girl you'd like to see behind the counter of your favorite delicatessen, knowing that you need not shudder as her fingers touch your Sunday night supper slices of tongue and Swiss cheese and ham. No girl had ever dreamed of refusing to allow Gussie to borrow her chamois for a second. To-night Miss Fink had come in at 10 p.m., which was just 2 hours later than usual. She knew that she was to work until 6 a.m., which may have accounted for the fact that she displayed very little of what the fans call ginger as she removed her hat and coat and hung them on the hook behind the desk. The prospect of that all-night, 8-hour stretch may have accounted for it, I say. But privately, and entre nous, it didn't. For here you must know of Heiny. Heiny, alas, now Henri. Until 2 weeks ago, Henri had been Heiny, and Miss Fink had been Kid. When Henri had been Heiny, he had worked in the kitchen at many things, but always with a loving eye on Miss Gussie Fink. Then one wild night there had been a waiter's strike, wages or hours or tips or all three. In the confusion that followed, Heiny had been pressed into service and a chopped coat. He had fitted into both with unbelievable nicety, proving that waiters are born, not made. Those little tricks and foibles that are characteristic of the genus waiter seemed to envelop him as though a fairy garment had fallen upon his shoulders. The folded napkin under his arm seemed to have been placed there by nature, so perfectly did it fit into place. The ghostly tread, the little whisking skip, the half-simper, the deferential bend that had in it at the same time something of insolence, all were there. The very "Yes, miss," and "Very good, sir," rose automatically and correctly to his untrained lips. Cinderella, rising resplendent from her ash-strewn hearth, was not more completely transformed than Heiny in his role of Henri. And with the transformation, Miss Gussie Fink had been left behind her desk disconsolate. Kitchens are as quick to seize upon these things and gossip about them as drawing-rooms are. And because Miss Gussie Fink had always worn a little air of aloofness to all except Heiny, the kitchen was the more eager to make the most of its morsel. Each turned it over under his tongue. Tony, the crook, whom Miss Fink had scorned; Francois, the entree cook, who often forgot he was married; Miss Sweeney, the bar checker, who was jealous of Miss Fink's complexion. Miss Fink heard and said nothing. She only knew that there would be no dear figure waiting for her when the night's work was done. For 2 weeks now she had put on her hat and coat and gone her way at 1 o'clock alone. She discovered that to be taken home night after night under Heiny's tender escort had taught her a ridiculous terror of the streets at night, now that she was without protection. Always the short walk from the car to the flat where Miss Fink lived with her mother had been a glorious, starlit, all too brief moment. Now it was an endless and terrifying trial, a thing of shivers and dread, fraught with horror of passing the alley just back of Cassidy's buffet. There had even been certain little half-serious, half-jesting talks about the future into which there had entered the subject of a little delicatessen and restaurant in a desirable neighborhood, with Heiny in the kitchen, and a certain blonde, neat, white shirt-waisted person in charge of the desk and front shop. She and her mother had always gone through a little formula upon Miss Fink's return from work. They never used it now. Gussie's mother was a real mother, the kind that wakes up when you come home. "That you, Gussie?" Ma Fink would call from the bedroom at the sound of the key in the lock. "It's me, Ma." "Heiny bring you home?" "Sure." Happily. "There's a bit of sausage left and some pie if—" "Oh, I ain't hungry. We stopped at Joey's downtown and had a cup of coffee and a ham on rye. Did you remember to put out the milk bottle?" For 2 weeks there'd been none of that. Gussie had learned to creep silently into bed, and her mother, being a mother, feigned sleep. Tonight, at her desk, Miss Gussie Fink seemed a shade cooler, more self-contained and daisy-like than ever. From somewhere at the back of her head she could see that Heiny was avoiding her desk and was using the services of the checker at the other end of the room. And even as the poison of this was eating into her heart, she was tapping her forefinger imperatively on the desk before her and saying to Tony, the crook, "Down on that table with that tray, Tony. Flat. This may be a busy little New Year's Eve, but you can't come any of your sleight-of-hand stuff on me." For Tony had a little trick of concealing $1.25 sirloin by the simple method of slapping the platter close to the underside of his tray and holding it there with long, lean fingers outspread, the entire bit of knavery being concealed in the folds of a flowing white napkin in the hand that balanced the tray. Into Tony's eyes there came a baleful gleam. His lean jaw jutted out threateningly. "You're a real Weisenheimer kid, ain't you?" he sneered. "Never mind. I'll get you at recess." "Some day," drawled Miss Fink, checking the steak, The house will get wise to your stuff, and then you'll have to go back to the coal wagon. I know so much about you, it's beginning to make me uncomfortable. I hate to carry around a burden of crime." "You're a sorehead because Heiny turned you down, and now—" "Move on there!" snapped Miss Fink, "or I'll call the steward to settle you. Maybe he'd be interested to know that you've been counting in the date and your waiter's number and adding 'em at the bottom of your check." Tony, the crook, turned and skimmed away toward the dining room, but the taste of victory was bitter in Miss Fink's mouth. Midnight struck. There came from the direction of the pink fountain room a clamor and din which penetrated the thickness of the padded doors that separated the dining room from the kitchen beyond. The sound rose and swelled above the blare of the orchestra. Chairs scraped on the marble floors as hundreds rose to their feet. The sound of clinking glasses became as the jangling of 100 bells. There came the sharp spat of hand-clapping, then cheers, yells, huzzas. Through the swinging doors at the end of the long passageway, Miss Fink could catch glimpses of dazzling color, of shimmering gowns, of bare arms uplifted, of flowers and plumes and jewels, with the rosy light of the famed pink fountain casting a gracious glow over all. Once she saw a tall young fellow throw his arm about the shoulder of a glorious creature at the next table, and though the door swung shut before she could see it, Miss Fink knew that he had kissed her. There were no New Year's greetings in the kitchen back of the pink fountain room. It was the busiest moment in all that busy night. The heat of the ovens was so intense that it could be felt as far as Miss Fink's remote corner. The swinging doors between dining room and kitchen were never still. A steady stream of waiters made for the steam tables before which the white-clad chefs stood ladling, carving, basting, serving, gave their orders, received them, stopped at the checking desk, and sped dining roomward again. Tony, the crook, was cursing at one of the little Polish vegetable girls who had not been quick enough about the garnishing of a salad, and she was saying over and over again in her thick tongue, "Aw, shut up your mout!" The thud-thud of Miss Fink's checking stamp kept time to flying footsteps, but even as her practiced eye swept over the tray before her she saw the steward direct Henri toward her desk, just as he was about to head in the direction of the minor checking desk. Beneath downcast lids she saw him coming. There was about Henri tonight a certain radiance, a sort of electrical elasticity, so nimble, so tireless, so exuberant was he. In the eyes of Miss Gussie Fink, he looked heartbreakingly handsome in his waiter's uniform. Handsome, distinguished, remote, and infinitely desirable. And just behind him, revenge in his eye, came Tony. The flat surface of the desk received Henri's tray. Miss Fink regarded it with a cold and businesslike stare. Henri whipped his napkin from under his left arm and began to remove covers dexterously. Off came the first silver dome-shaped top. "Guinea hen," said Henri. "I seen her looking at you when you served the little necks," came from Tony as though continuing a conversation begun in some past moment of pause. "And she's some lovely doll, believe me." Miss Fink scanned the guinea hen thoroughly, but with a detached air, and selected the proper stamp from the box at her elbow. Thump! On the broad pasteboard sheet before her appeared the figures $1.75 after Henri's number. "Think so?" grinned Henri, and removed another cover. "1 candied sweets." "I bet some day we'll see you in the Sunday papers, Heiny," went on Tony, "with a piece about handsome waiter running away with beautiful society girl. Say, you're too perfect even for a waiter." Thump! 30 cents. "Quit your kiddin'," said the flattered Henri. "1 endive French dressing." Thump! "Next," said Miss Fink dispassionately, yawned, and smiled fleetingly at the entree cook, who wasn't looking her way. Then, as Tony slid his tray toward her, "How's business, Tony? How many 2-bit cigar bands? Have you slipped onto your own private collection of nickel straights and made a 20-cent rake-off?" But there was a mist in the bright brown eyes as Tony the crook turned away with his tray. In spite of the satisfaction of having had the last word, Miss Fink knew in her heart that Tony had got her at recess, as he had said he would. Things were slowing up for Miss Fink. The stream of hurrying waiters was turned in the direction of the kitchen bar now. From now on the eating would be light and the drinking heavy. Miss Fink, with time hanging heavy, found herself blinking down at the figures stamped on the pasteboard sheet before her, and in spite of the blinking, 2 marks that never were intended for a checker's report splashed down just over the $1.75 after Henri's number. A lovely doll. And she had gazed at Heiny. Well, That was to be expected. No woman could gaze unmoved upon Heiny. A lovely doll. "Hi, Miss Fink." It was the steward's voice. "We need you over in the bar to help Miss Sweeney check the drinks. They're coming too swift for her. Eating'll be light from now on. Just a little something salty now and then." So Miss Fink dabbed covertly at her eyes and betook herself out of the atmosphere of roasting and broiling and frying and stewing, away from the sight of great copper kettles and glowing coals and hissing pans, into a little world fragrant with mint, breathing of orange and lemon peel, perfumed with pineapple, redolent of cinnamon and clove, reeking with things spirituous. Here the splutter of the broiler was replaced by the hiss of the siphon, and the pop-pop of corks, and the tinkle and clink of ice against glass. "Hello, dearie," cooed Miss Sweeney in greeting, staring hard at the suspicious redness around Miss Fink's eyelids. "Ain't you sweet to come over here in the headache department and help me out? Here's the wine list. You probably need it. Say, who do you suppose invented New Year's Eve? They must have had imagination like a Greek busboy. I'm limp as a rag now, and it's only 2:30. I've got a regular cramp in my wrist from checking quarts. Say, did you hear about Heiny's crowd?" "No," said Miss Fink evenly, and began to study the first page of the wine list under the heading Champagnes of Noted Vintages. "Well," went on Miss Sweeney's little, thin, malicious voice, "he's fell in soft. There's a table of 3, and they're drinking 1874 Imperial Crown at $12 per, like it was Waukesha ale. And every time they finish a bottle, one of the guys pays for it with a brand new 10 and a brand new 5 and tells Heiny to keep the change. Can you beat it?" "I hope," said Miss Fink pleasantly, "that the supply of 1874 will hold out till morning. I'd hate to see them have to come down to $10 wine. Here, you, Tony, come back here. I may be a new hand in this department, but I'm not so green that you can put a gold label over on me as a yellow label. Notice that I'm checking you another 50 cents. "Ain't he the grafter?" laughed Miss Sweeney. She leaned toward Miss Fink and lowered her voice discreetly. "Though I'll say this for him, if you let him get away with it now and then, he'll split even with you. Oh, well, now don't get so high and mighty. The management expects it in this department. That's why they pay starvation wages." An unusual note of color crept into Miss Gussie Fink's smooth cheek. It deepened and glowed as Heiny darted around the corner and up to the bar. There was about him an air of suppressed excitement, suppressed because Heiny was too perfect a waiter to display emotion. "Not another!" chanted the bartenders in chorus. "Yes," answered Henri solemnly, and waited while the wine cellar was made to relinquish another rare jewel. "Oh, you Heiny," called Miss Sweeney. "Tell us what she looks like. If I had time, I'd take a peek myself. From what Tony says, she must look something like Maxine Elliott, only brighter." Henri turned. He saw Miss Fink. A curious little expression came into his eyes, a Heiny look, it might have been called, as he regarded his erstwhile sweetheart's unruffled attire and clear skin and steady eye and glossy hair. She was looking past him in that baffling, maddening way that angry women have. Some of Henri's poise seemed to desert him in that moment. He appeared a shade less debonair as he received the precious bottle from the wine man's hands. He made for Miss Fink's desk and stood watching her while she checked his order. At the door he turned and looked over his shoulder at Miss Sweeney. "Sometime," he said deliberately, "when there's no ladies around, I'll tell you what I think she looks like." And the little glow of color in Miss Gussie Fink's smooth cheek became a crimson flood that swept from brow to throat. "Oh, well," snickered Miss Sweeney to hide her own discomfiture. "This is little Heiny's first New Year's Eve in the dining room. Honest, I believe he's shocked. He don't realize to celebrate New Year's Eve is like eating oranges. You gotta let go your dignity to really enjoy 'em." 3 times more did Henri enter and demand a bottle of the famous vintage, and each time he seemed a shade less buoyant. His elation diminished as his tips grew greater until, as he drew up at the bar at 6 o'clock, he seemed wrapped in impenetrable gloom. "Them hogs sousing yet?" shrilled Miss Sweeney. She and Miss Fink had climbed down from their high stools and were preparing to leave. Henri nodded drearily and disappeared in the direction of the pink fountain room. Miss Fink walked back to her own desk in the corner near the dining room door. She took her hat off the hook and stood regarding it thoughtfully. Then, with a little air of decision, she turned and walked swiftly down the passageway that separated dining room from kitchen. Tilly, the scrub woman, was down on her hands and knees in one corner of the passage. She was one of a small army of cleaners that had begun the work of clearing away the debris of the long night's revel. Miss Fink lifted her neat skirts high as she tiptoed through the little soapy pool that followed in the wake of Tilly, the scrub woman. She opened the swinging doors a cautious little crack and peered in. What she saw was not pretty. If the words sordid and bacchanalian had been part of Miss Fink's vocabulary, they would have risen to her lips then. The crowd had gone. The great room contained not more than half a dozen people. Confetti littered the floor. Here and there a napkin, crushed and bedraggled into an unrecognizable ball, lay under a table. From an overturned bottle the dregs were dripping drearily. The air was stale, stifling, poisonous. At a little table in the center of the room, Henri's three were still drinking. They were doing it in a dreadful and businesslike way. There were 2 men and 1 woman. The faces of all 3 were mahogany-colored and expressionless. There was about them an awful sort of stillness. Something in the sight seemed to sicken Gussie Fink. It came to her that the wintry air outdoors must be gloriously sweet and cool and clean in contrast to this. She was about to turn away, with a last look at Heiny yawning behind his hand, when suddenly the woman rose unsteadily to her feet, balancing herself with her fingertips on the table. She raised her head and stared across the room with dull, unseeing eyes, and licked her lips with her tongue. Then she turned and walked half a dozen paces, screamed once with horrible shrillness, and crashed to the floor. She lay there in a still, crumpled heap, the folds of her exquisite gown rippling to meet a little stale pool of wine that had splashed from some broken glass. Then this happened. 3 people ran toward the woman on the floor, and 2 people ran past her and out of the room. The 2 who ran away were the men with whom she had been drinking, and they were not seen again. The 3 who ran toward her were Henri, the waiter, Miss Gussie Fink, checker, and Tilly, the scrub woman. Henri and Miss Fink reached her first. Tilly, the scrub woman, was a close third. Miss Gussie Fink made as though to slip her arm under the poor bruised head, but Henri caught her wrist fiercely, for a waiter, and pulled her to her feet almost roughly. "You leave her alone, kid," he commanded. Miss Gussie Fink stared, indignation choking her utterance, and as she stared the fierce light in Henri's eyes was replaced by the light of tenderness. "We'll tend to her," said Henri. "She ain't fit for you to touch. I wouldn't let you soil your hands on such truck." And while Gussie still stared, he grasped the unconscious woman by the shoulders, while another waiter grasped her ankles, with Tilly, the scrub woman, arranging her draperies pityingly around her, and together they carried her out of the dining room to a room beyond. Back in the kitchen, Miss Gussie Fink was preparing to don her hat, but she was experiencing some difficulty because of the way in which her fingers persisted in trembling. Her face was turned away from the swinging doors, but she knew when Henri came in. He stood just behind her, in silence. When she turned to face him, she found Henri looking at her, and as he looked, all the Heiny in him came to the surface and shone in his eyes. He looked long and silently at Miss Gussie Fink, at the sane, simple wholesomeness of her, at her clear brown eyes, at her white forehead from which the shining hair sprang away in such a delicate line, at her immaculately white shirtwaist, and her smooth, snug-fitting collar that came up to the lobes of her little pink ears, at her creamy skin, at her trim belt. He looked as one who would rest his eyes weary of gazing upon satins and jewels and rouge and carmine and white arms and bosoms. "Gee, kid, you look good to me," he said. "Do I, Heiny?" whispered Miss Fink. "Believe me," replied Heiny fervently, "it was just a case of swelled head. Forget it, will you? Say, that gang in there tonight. Why, say, that gang—" "I know," interrupted Miss Fink. "Going home?" asked Heiny. "Yes." "Suppose we have a bite of something to eat first," suggested Heiny. Miss Fink glanced round the great deserted kitchen. As she gazed, a little expression of disgust wrinkled her pretty nose, the nose that perforce had sniffed the scent of so many rare and exquisite dishes. "Sure," she assented joyously. "But not here. Let's go around the corner to Joey's. I could get real chummy with a cup of good hot coffee and a ham on rye." He helped her on with her coat, and if his hands rested a moment on her shoulders, who was there to see it? A few sleepy, wan-eyed waiters and Tilly, the scrub woman. Together they started toward the door. Tilly, the scrub woman, had worked her wet way out of the passage and into the kitchen proper. She and her pail blocked their way. She was sopping up a soapy pool with an all-encompassing gray scrub rag. Heiny and Gussie stopped a moment, perforce, to watch her. It was rather fascinating to see how that artful scrub rag craftily closed in upon the soapy pool until it engulfed it. Tilly sat back on her knees to wring out the water-soaked rag. There was something pleasing in the sight. Tilly's blue calico was faded white in patches, and at the knees it was dark with soapy water. Her shoes were turned up ludicrously at the toes, as scrub-woman's shoes always are. Tilly's thin hair was wadded back into a moist knob at the back and skewered with a gray-black hairpin. From her parboiled, shriveled fingers to her ruddy, perspiring face there was nothing of grace or beauty about Tilly. And yet Heiny found something pleasing there. He could not have told you why, so how can I? Unless to say that it was, perhaps, for much the same reason that we rejoice in the wholesome, safe, reassuring feel of the gray woolen blanket on our bed when we wake from a horrid dream. "A Happy New Year to you," said Heiny gravely, and took his hand out of his pocket. Tilly's moist right hand closed over something. She smiled so that one saw all her broken black teeth. "The same to you," said Tilly. "The same to you." End of Story 5. The Kitchen Side of the Door. Story 6. One of the Old Girls of Buttered Side Down. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Madeira. Story 6. One of the Old Girls of Buttered Side Down by Edna Ferber. All of those ladies who end their conversation with you by wearily suggesting that you go down to the basement to find what you seek do not receive a meager $7 a week as a reward for their efforts. Neither are they all obliged to climb 5 weary flights of stairs to reach the dismal little courtroom which is their home. And there are several who need not walk 33 blocks to save car fare, only to spend wretched evenings washing out handkerchiefs and stockings in the cracked little washbowl, while one ear is cocked for the stealthy tread of the lady who objects. The earnest compiler of working girls' budgets would pass Effie Bauer hurriedly by. Effie's budget bulged here and there with such pathetic items as hand-embroidered blouses, thick club steaks, and parquet tickets for Maude Adams. That you may visualize her at once, I may say that Effie looked 24, from the rear. All women do these days of girlish simplicity in hats and tailor-mades. Her skirts never sat, her shirt-waists were marvels of plainness and fit, and her switch had cost her $16, wholesale, a lady friend in the business. Oh, there was nothing tragic about Effie. She had a plump, assured style, a keen blue eye, a gift of repartee, and a way of doing her hair so that the gray at the sides scarcely showed at all. Also a knowledge of corsets that had placed her at the buying end of that important department at Spiegel's. Effie knew to the minute when coral beads went out and pearl beads came in, and just by looking at her blouses you could tell when Clooney died and Irish was born. Meeting Effie on the street, you would have put her down as one of the many well-dressed, prosperous-looking women shoppers, if you hadn't looked at her feet. Veteran clerks and policemen cannot disguise their feet. Effie Bauer's reason for not marrying when a girl was the same as that of most of the capable, wise-eyed, good-looking women one finds at the head of departments. She had not had a chance. If Effie had been as attractive at 20 as she was at... There, we won't betray confidences. Still, It is certain that if Effie had been as attractive when a young girl as she was when an old girl, she never would have been an old girl and head of Spiegel's corset department at a salary of something very comfortably over $125 a month, and commissions. Effie had improved with the years, and ripened with experience. She knew her value. At 20 she had been pale, anemic, and bony, with a startled fawn manner and bad teeth. Years of saleswomanship had broadened her, mentally and physically, until she possessed a wide and varied knowledge of that great and diversified subject known as human nature. She knew human nature all the way from the 59-cent girdles to the $25 made-to-orders. And if the years had brought, among other things, a certain hardness about the jaw and a line or two at the corners of the eyes, it was not surprising. You can't rub up against the sharp edges of this world and expect to come out without a scratch or so. So much for Effie. Enter the hero. Webster defines a hero in romance as the person who has the principal share in the transactions related. He says nothing which would debar a gentleman just because he may be a trifle bald and in the habit of combing his hair over the thin spot. And he raises no objections to a matter of thickness and color in the region of the back of the neck. Therefore Gabe I. Marks qualifies. Gabe was the gentleman about whom Effie permitted herself to be guyed. He came to Chicago on business 4 times a year, and he always took Effie to the theater and to supper afterward. On those occasions Effie's gown, wrap, and hat were as correct in texture, lines, and paradise aigrettes as those of any of her non-working sisters about her. On the morning following these excursions into lobsterdom, Effie would confide to her friend Miss Weinstein of the lingeries and negligees. "I was out with my friend Mr. Marks last evening. We went to Rector's after the show." "Oh, well, it takes a New Yorker to know how. Honestly, I feel like a queen when I go out with him." "Oh, nothing like that, girlie. I never could see that marriage thing. Just good friends." Gabe had been coming to Chicago 4 times a year for 6 years. 6 times 4 are 24. And 1 is 25. Gabe's last visit made the 25th. "Well, Effie," Gabe said when the evening's entertainment had reached the restaurant stage, "this is our 25th anniversary. It's our silver wedding without the silver in the wedding. We'll have a bottle of champagne. That makes it almost legal. And then suppose we finish up by having the wedding. The silver can be omitted." Effie had been humming with the orchestra, holding a lobster claw in one hand and wielding the little 2-pronged fork with the other. She dropped claw, fork, and popular air to stare open-mouthed at Gabe. Then a slow, uncertain smile crept about her lips, although her eyes were still unsmiling. "Stop your joking, Gaby," she said. "Someday you'll say those things to the wrong lady, and then you'll have a breach of promise suit on your hands." "This ain't no joke, Effie," Gabe had replied. "Not with me it ain't. As long as my mother Selig lived, I wouldn't ever marry a goy. It would have broken her heart. I was a good son to her, and good sons make good husbands, they say. Well, Effie, you want to try it out?" There was something almost solemn in Effie's tone and expression. "Gaby," she said slowly, "you're the first man that's ever asked me to marry him." "That goes double," answered Gabe. "Thanks," said Effie. "That makes it all the nicer." "Then—" Gabe's face was radiant, but Effie shook her head quickly. "You're just 20 years late," she said. "Late?" expostulated Gabe. "I ain't no dead one yet." Effie pushed her plate away with a little air of decision, folded her plump arms on the table, and, leaning forward, looked Gabe I. Marks squarely in the eyes. "Gaby," she said gently, "I'll bet you haven't got $100 in the bank." "But," interrupted Gabe, "wait a minute. I know you boys on the road. Besides your diamond scarf pin and your ring and watch, have you got a cent over your salary? Nix. You carry just about enough insurance to bury you, don't you?
You're 50 years old if you're a minute, Gaby. And if I ain't mistaken, you'd have a pretty hard time of it getting $10,000 insurance after the doctors got through with you. 25 years of pinochle and poker and the fat of the land haven't added up any bumps in the old stocking under the mattress.
Say, look a here, objected Gabe, more red-faced than usual. I didn't know was proposing to no senatorial investigating committee. Say, you talk about them foreign noblemen being mercenary. Why, they ain't in it with you girls today. A feller has got to propose to you with this bank book in one hand and a bunch of life insurance policies in the other. You're right. I ain't saved much, but Ma Selig always had everything she wanted. Say, when a man marries, it's different. He begins to save.
There, said Effie quickly. That's just it. 20 years ago, I'd have been glad and willing to start like that, saving and scrimping and loving a man and looking forward to the time when 4 figures showed up in the bank account where but 3 bloomed before. Give me a yard or so of cretonne and a photo of my married sister down in Iowa, and I can make even a boarding house inside bedroom look like a place where a human being could live. If I had been as wise at 20 as I am now, Gaby, I could have married any man I pleased. But I was what they call capable. And men aren't marrying capable girls. They pick little yellow-headed, blue-eyed idiots that don't know a lamb stew from a soup bone when they see it. Well, Mr. Man didn't show up, and I started in to clerk at 6 per. I'm earning as much as you are now. More. Now, don't misunderstand me, Gabe. I'm not throwing bouquets at myself. I'm not that kind of girl. But I could sell a style 743 slim shape to the Venus de Milo herself. The Lord knows she needed one with those hips of hers. I worked my way up alone. I'm used to it. I like the excitement down at the store. I'm used to luxuries. I guess if I was a man, I'd be the kind they call a good provider. The kind that opens wine every time there's half an excuse for it. And when he dies, his widow has to take in boarders. And, Gabe, after you've worn tailored suits every year for a dozen years, you can't go back to $25 ready-mades and be happy.
You could if you loved a man, said Gabe stubbornly.
The hard lines around the jaw and the experienced lines about the eyes seemed suddenly to stand out on Effie's face. Love's young dream is all right, but you've reached the age when you let your cigar ash dribble down onto your vest. Now me, I've got a kimono nature but a straight front job, and it's kept me young. Young. I've got to be. That's my stock and trade. You see, Gaby, we're just 20 years too late, both of us. They're not going to boost your salary. These days, they're looking for kids on the road. Live wires with a lot of nerve and a quick comeback. They don't want old-timers. Say, Gaby, if I was to tell you what I spend in face powder and toilet water and hairpins alone, you'd think I'd made a mistake and given you the butcher bill instead. And I'm no professional beauty either. Only it takes money to look cleaned and pressed in this town. In the seclusion of the cafe corner, Gabe laid one plump, highly manicured hand on Effie's smooth arm. You wouldn't need to stay young for me, Effie. I like you just as you are, without the powder or the toilet water or the hairpins. His red, good-natured face had an expression upon it that was touchingly near patient resignation as he looked up into Effie's sparkling countenance. You never looked so good to me as you do this minute, old girl. And if the day comes when you get lonesome, want to change your mind, or... Effie shook her head and started to draw on her long white gloves. I guess I haven't refused you the way the dames in the novels do it. Maybe it's because I've had so little practice. But I want to say this, Gabe. Thank God I don't have to die knowing that no man ever wanted me to be his wife. Honestly, I'm that grateful that I'd marry you in a minute if I didn't like you so well.
I'll be back in 3 months, like always, was all that Gabe said. I ain't going to write. When I get here, we'll just take in a show. And the younger you look, the better I'll like it.
But on the occasion of Gabe's spring trip, he encountered a statuesque blonde person where Effie had been wont to reign.
Miss Bauer out of town?
The statue melted a trifle in the sunshine of Gabe's ingratiating smile. Miss Bauer's ill, the the statue informed him, using a heavy Eastern accent. "Anything I can do for you? I'm taking her place."
"Why, not exactly, no," said Gabe. "Just a temporary indisposition, I suppose."
"Well, you wouldn't hardly call it that, seeing that she's been sick with typhoid for 7 weeks.
"Typhoid!" shouted Gabe.
Well, I'm not in the habit of asking gentlemen their names. I'd like to inquire if yours happens to be Marks. Gabe I. Marks?"
"Sure," said Gabe. "That's me."
"Miss Bower's nurse telephones down last week that if a gentleman named Marks, Gabe I. Marks, drops in and inquires for Miss Bower, I'm to tell him that she's changed her mind."
On the way from Spiegel's corset department to the car, Gabe stopped only for a bunch of violets. Effie's apartment house reached, he sent up his card, the violets, and a message that the gentleman was waiting. There came back a reply that sent Gaby up before the violets were relieved of their first layer of tissue paper. Effie was sitting in a deep chair by the window, a flowered quilt bunched about her shoulders, her feet in gray knitted bedroom slippers. She looked every minute of her age, and she knew it, and didn't care. The hand that she held out to Gabe was a limp, white, fleshless thing that seemed to bear no relation to the plump, firm member that Gabe had pressed on so many previous occasions. Gabe stared at this pale wraith in a moment of alarm and dismay. Then,
"You're looking great," he stammered. "Great! Nobody'd believe you've been sick a minute. Guess you've just been stalling for a beauty rest, what?"
Effie smiled a tired little smile and shook her head slowly. "You're a good kid, Gaby, to lie to me like that just to make me feel good. But my nurse left yesterday, and I had my first real squint at myself in the mirror. She wouldn't let me look while she was here. After what I saw staring back at me from that glass, a whole ballroom full of French courtiers whispering sweet nothings in my ear couldn't make me believe that I looked like anything but a hunk of Roquefort, green spots included. When I think of how my clothes won't fit, it makes me shiver."
"Oh, you'll be back at the store as good as new. They fatten up something wonderful after typhoid. Why, I had a friend—"
"Did you get my message?" interrupted Effie.
"I was only talking to hide my nervousness,"
said Gabe, and started forward. But Effie waved him away. "Sit down," she said. "I've got something to say." She looked thoughtfully down at one shining fingernail. Her lower lip was caught between her teeth. When she looked up again, her eyes were swimming in tears. Gabe started forward again. Again Effie waved him away. "It's all right, Gaby. I don't blubber as a rule. This fever leaves you as weak as a rag, and ready to cry if anyone says boo. I've been doing some high-pressure thinking since Nursey left. I had plenty of time to do it in, sitting here by this window all day. My land, I never knew there was so much time. There's been days when I haven't talked to a soul except the nurse and the chambermaid. Lonesome. Say, the amount of petting I could stand would surprise you. Of course, my nurse was a perfectly good nurse at 25 per. But I was just a case to her. You can't expect a nurse to ooze sympathy over an old maid with the fever. I tell you, I was dying to have someone say shh, 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 when there was a noise, just to show they were interested. Whenever I'd moan, the nurse would come over and stick a thermometer in my mouth and write something down on a chart. The boys and girls at the store sent flowers. They'd have done the same if I'd died. When the fever broke, I just used to lie there and dream, not feeling anything in particular, and not caring much whether it was day or night. Know what I mean?"
Gaby shook a sympathetic head. There was a little silence, then Effie went on.
"I used to think I was pretty smart, earning my own living, dressing as well as the next one, and able to spend my vacation in Atlantic City if I wanted to. I didn't know I was missing anything. But while I was sick, I got to wishing that there was somebody that belonged to me. Somebody to worry about me and to sit up nights. Somebody that just naturally felt they had to come tiptoeing into my room every 3 or 4 minutes to see if I was sleeping or had enough covers on or wanted a drink or something. I got to thinking what it would have been like if I had a husband and a home. You'll think I'm daffy, maybe. Gaby took Effie's limp white hand in his and stroked it gently. Effie's face was turned away from him, toward the noisy street. I used to imagine how he'd come home at 6, stamping his feet maybe, and making a lot of noise the way men do. And then he'd remember and come creaking up the steps, and he'd stick his head in at the door in the funny, awkward, pathetic way men have in a sick room. And he'd say, "How's the old girl tonight? I'd better not come near you now, Puss, because I'll bring the cold with me. Been lonesome for your old man?" And I'd say, "Oh, I don't care how cold you are, dear. The nurse is downstairs getting my supper ready." And then he'd come tiptoeing over to my bed and stoop down and kiss me, and his face would be all cold and rough, and his mustache would be wet, and he'd smell outdoorsy and smoky, the way husbands do when they come in. And I'd reach up and pat his cheek and say, "You need a shave, old man." "I know it," he'd say, rubbing his cheek up against mine. "Hurry up and wash now. Supper'll be ready." "Where are the kids?" he'd ask. "The house is as quiet as the grave. Hurry up and get well, kid. It's darn lonesome without you at the table, and the children's manners are getting something wild, and the children's manners are getting something awful, and I never can find my shirts. Lordy, I guess we won't celebrate when you get up. Can't you eat a little something nourishing for supper? Beefsteak or a good plate of soup or something?" Men are like that, you know. So I'd say then, "Run along, you old goose. You'll be suggesting sauerkraut and wieners next. Don't you let Millie have any marmalade tonight. She's got a spoiled stomach." And then he'd pound off down the hall to wash up, and I'd shut my eyes and smile to myself. And everything would be all right, because he was home. There was a long silence. Effie's eyes were closed, but 2 great tears stole out from beneath each lid and coursed their slow way down her thin cheeks. She did not raise her hand to wipe them away. Gaby's other hand reached over and met the one that already clasped Effie's. "Effie," he said, in a voice that was as hoarse as it was gentle. "Hmm?" said Effie. "Will you marry me?" "I shouldn't wonder," replied Effie, opening her eyes. "No, don't kiss me. You might catch something. But say, reach up and smooth my hair away from my forehead, will you? And call me a couple of fool names. I don't care how clumsy you are about it. I could stand an awful fuss being made over me, without being spoiled any." 3 weeks later, Effie was back at the store. Her skirt didn't fit in the back, and the little hollow places in her cheeks did not take the customary dash of rouge as well as when they had been plumper. She held a little impromptu reception that extended down as far as the lingeries and up as far as the rugs. The old sparkle came back to Effie's eye. The old assurance and vigor seemed to return. By the time that Miss Weinstein of the French lingeries arrived, breathless, to greet her, Effie was herself again. "Well, if you're not a sight for sore eyes, dearie," exclaimed Miss Weinstein. "My goodness, how grand and thin you are! I'd be willing to take a course in typhoid myself if I thought I could lose 25 pounds. "I haven't a rag that fits me," Effie announced proudly. Miss Weinstein lowered her voice discreetly. "Dearie, can you come down to my department for a minute? We're going to have a sale on imported lingerie blouses, slightly soiled, from 9 to 11 tomorrow. There's one you positively must see. Hand-embroidered, Irish motifs, and eyeletted from soup to nuts, and only $8.50. I've got a fine chance of buying handmade waists, no matter how slightly soiled," Effie made answer, "with a doctor and nurse's bill as long as your arm." "Oh, run along," scoffed Miss Weinstein. A person would think you had a husband to get a grouch every time you get reckless to the extent of a new waist. You're your own boss, and you know your credit's good. Honestly, it would be a shame to let this chance slip. You're not getting tight in your old age, are you?" No, faltered Effie. "But—" "Then come on," urged Miss Weinstein energetically. "And be thankful you haven't got a man to raise the dickens when the bill comes in."
Do you mean that?
asked Effie slowly, fixing Miss Weinstein with a thoughtful eye.
"Surest thing you know.
Say, girlie, let's go over to Klein's for lunch this noon. They have pot roast with potato pfannkuchen on Tuesdays, and we can split an order between us." "Hold that waist till tomorrow, will you?" said Effie. "I've made an arrangement with a friend that might make new clothes impossible just now, but I'm gonna wire my party that the arrangement is all off. I've changed my mind. I ought to get an answer tomorrow. Did you say it was a 36?
End of Story 6. One of the Old Girls of Buttered Side Down. Story 7. Maymeys from Cuba of Buttered Side Down. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Madeira. Buttered Side Down by Edna Ferber. Story 7. Maymeys from Cuba. There is nothing new in this. It has all been done before. But tell me, what is new? Does the inspiring and perspiring summer vaudeville artist flatter himself that his stuff is going big? Then does the stout man with the oyster-colored eyelids in the first row left turn his bullet head on his fat, creased neck to remark huskily to his companion, "The hook for him, rotten! The last one was an old Weber and Fields gag. They discarded it back in '91. Say, the good ones is all dead anyhow. Take old Salvini now, and Dan Rice, them was actors. Come on out and have something." Does the short story writer felicitate himself upon having discovered a rare species in humanity's garden? The blasé reader flips the pages between his fingers, yawns, stretches, and remarks to his wife, "That's a clean lift from Kipling. Or is it Conan Doyle? Anyway, I've read something just like it before. Say, kid, guess what these magazine guys get for a full-page ad? Nix. That's just like a woman. 3,000 straight. Fact." To anticipate the delver into the past, it may be stated that the plot of this one originally appeared in the eternal bestseller under the heading, "He asked you for bread, and ye gave him a stone." There may be those who could not have traced my plagiarism to its source. Although the book has had an unprecedentedly long run, it is said to be less widely read than of yore. Even with this preparation, I hesitate to confess that this is the story of a hungry girl in a big city. Well, now, wait a minute. Conceding that it has been done by every scribbler from tyro to bestseller expert, you will acknowledge that there is the possibility of a fresh viewpoint, twist. What is it the sporting editors call it? Oh, yes, slant. There is the possibility of getting a new slant on an old idea. That may serve to deflect the line of the deadly parallel. Just off State Street there is a fruiterer and importer who ought to be arrested for cruelty. His window is the most fascinating and the most heartless in Chicago. A line of open-mouthed, wide-eyed gazers is always to be found before it. Despair, wonder, envy, and rebellion smolder in the eyes of those gazers. No shop window show should be so diabolically set forth as to arouse such sensations in the breast of the beholder. It is a work of art, that window, a breeder of anarchism, a destroyer of contentment, a second feast of Tantalus. It boasts peaches dewy and golden, when peaches have no right to be. Plethoric purple bunches of English hothouse grapes are there to taunt the $10 a week clerk whose sick wife should be in the hospital.
Strawberries glow therein when shortcake is a last summer's memory, and forced cucumbers remind us that we are taking ours in the form of dill pickles. There is, perhaps, a choice head of cauliflower so exquisite in its ivory and green perfection as to be fit for a bride's bouquet. There are apples so flawless that if the Garden of Eden grew any as perfect, it is small wonder that Eve fell for them. There are fresh mushrooms and jumbo coconuts and green almonds. Costly things in beds of cotton nestle next to strange and marvelous things in tissue wrappings. Oh, that window is no place for the hungry, the dissatisfied, or the man out of a job. When the air is filled with snow, there is that in the sight of muskmelons which incites crime. Queerly enough, the gazers before that window foot up the same, year in and year out, something after this fashion. Item: one anemic little milliner's apprentice in coat and shoes that even her hat can't redeem. Item: one sandy-haired, gritty-complexioned man with a drooping, ragged mustache, a tin dinner bucket, and lime on his boots. Item: one thin mail carrier with an empty mail sack, gaunt cheeks, and a habitual droop to his left shoulder. Item: one errand boy troubled with a chronic sniffle, a shrill and piping whistle, and a great deal of shuffling footwork. Item: one Negro wearing a spotted tan topcoat, frayed trousers, and no collar. His eyes seem all whites as he gazes. Enough of the window. But bear it in mind while we turn to Jenny. Jenny's real name was Janet, and she was Scotch. Canny? Not necessarily, or why should she have been hungry and out of a job in January? Jenny stood in the row before the window and stared. The longer she stared, the sharper grew the lines that fright and underfeeding had chiseled about her nose and mouth and eyes. When your last meal is an 18-hour-old memory, and when that memory has only near coffee and a roll to dwell on, there is something in the sight of January peaches and great strawberries carelessly spilling out of a tipped box, just like they do in the fruit picture on the dining-room wall, that is apt to carve sharp lines in the corners of the face. The tragic line dwindled, going about its business. The man with the dinner pail and the lime on his boots spat, drew the back of his hand across his mouth, and turned away with an ugly look. Pork was up to $14.25, dressed. The errand boy's blithe whistle died down to a mournful dirge. He was window-wishing. His choice wavered between the juicy pears and the foreign-looking red things that looked like oranges and weren't. One hand went into his coat pocket, extracting an apple that was to have formed the piece de resistance of his noonday lunch. Now he regarded it with a sort of pitying disgust, and bit into it with the middle-of-the-morning contempt that it deserved. The mail carrier pushed back his cap and reflectively scratched his head. How much over his month's wage would that green basket piled high with exotic fruit come to? Jenny stood and stared after they had left, and another line had formed. If you could have followed her gaze with dotted lines, as they do in the cartoons, you would have seen that it was not the peaches, or the prickly pears, or the strawberries, or the muskmelon, or even the grapes that held her eye. In the center of that wonderful window was an oddly woven basket. In the basket were brown things that looked like sweet potatoes. One knew that they were not. A sign over the basket informed the puzzled gazer that these were maymeys from Cuba. Maymeys from Cuba. The humor of it might have struck Jenny if she had not been so Scotch and so hungry. As it was, a slow, sullen, heavy Scotch wrath rose in her breast. Maymeys from Cuba. The wantonness of it. Peaches, yes. Grapes, even, and pears and cherries in snow time, but maymeys from Cuba? Why, one did not even know if they were to be eaten with butter, or with vinegar, or in the hand like an apple. Who wanted maymeys from Cuba. They had gone all those hundreds of miles to get a fruit or vegetable thing, a thing so luxurious, so out of all reason that one did not know whether it was to be baked or eaten raw. There they lay in their foreign-looking basket, taunting Jenny, who needed a quarter. Have I told you how Jenny happened to be hungry and jobless? Well, then I shan't. It doesn't really matter, anyway. The fact is enough. If you really demand to know, you might inquire of Mr. Felix Klein. You will find him in a mahogany office on the 6th floor. The door is marked Manager. It was his idea to import Scotch lassies from Dunfermline for his Scotch linen department. The idea was more fetching than feasible. There are people who will tell you that no girl possessing a grain of common sense and a little nerve need go hungry, no matter how great the city. Don't you believe them? The city has heard the cry of wolf so often that it refuses to listen when he is snarling at the door, particularly when the door is next door. Where did we leave Jenny? Still standing on the sidewalk before the fruit and fancy goods shop, gazing at the maymeys from Cuba. Finally, her Scotch bump of curiosity could stand it no longer. She dug her elbow into the arm of the person standing next in line. "What are those?" she asked. The next in line happened to be a man. He was a man without an overcoat, and with his chin sunk deep into his collar and his hands thrust deep into his pockets. It looked as though he were trying to crawl inside himself for warmth. "Those? The sign says they're maymeys from Cuba." "I know," persisted Jenny. "But what are they?" "Search me. Say, I ain't bothering about maymeys from Cuba. Couple of hot Murphys from Ireland served with a lump of butter would look good enough to me." "Do you suppose anyone buys them?" marveled Jenny. "Surest thing you know. Some rich dame coming by here, wondering what she can have for dinner to tempt the jaded palates of her dear ones, see? She sees them Cuban maymeys. The very thing, she says. I'll have 'em served just before the salad. And she sails in and buys a pound or two. I wonder now, do you eat 'em with a fruit knife or with a spoon?" Jenny took one last look at the woven basket with its foreign contents. Then she moved on, slowly. She had been moving on for hours, weeks. Most people have acquired the habit of eating 3 meals a day. In a city of some few millions, the habit has made necessary the establishing of many thousands of eating places. Jenny would have told you that there were billions of these. To her the world seemed composed of one huge glittering restaurant, with myriads of windows through which one caught maddening glimpses of ketchup bottles, and nickel coffee heaters, and piles of doughnuts, and scurrying waiters in white, and people critically studying menu cards. She walked in a maze of restaurants, cafes, eating houses. Tables and diners loomed up at every turn, on every street, from Michigan Avenue's rose-shaded Louis the Something palaces, where every waiter owns his man, to the white tile mausoleums where every man is his own waiter. Everywhere there were windows full of lemon cream pies, and pans of baked apples swimming in lakes of golden syrup, and pots of baked beans with the pink and crispy slices of pork just breaking through the crust. Every dairy lunch mocked one with the sign of wheat cakes with maple syrup and country sausage, 20 cents. There are those who will say that for cases like Jenny's there are soup kitchens, YWCAs, relief associations, policemen, and things like that. And so there are. Unfortunately, the people who need them aren't up on them. Try it. Plant yourself, penniless, in the middle of State Street on a busy day. Dive into the howling, scrambling, pushing maelstrom that hurls itself against the mountainous and impregnable form of the crossing policeman, and see what you'll get out of it, provided you have the courage. Desperation gave Jenny a false courage. On the strength of it she made 2 false starts. The third time she reached the arm of the crossing policeman and clutched it. That imposing giant removed the whistle from his mouth and majestically inclined his head without turning his gaze upon Jenny, one eye being fixed on a red automobile that was showing signs of sulking at its enforced pause, the other being busy with a cursing drayman who was having an argument with his off horse. Jenny mumbled her question. Said the crossing policeman, "Get your car on Wabash, ride to Umpty Second, transfer, get off at Blank Street, and walk 3 blocks south." Then he put the whistle back in his mouth, blew 2 shrill blasts, and the horde of men, women, motors, drays, trucks, cars, and horses swept over him, through him, past him, leaving him miraculously untouched. Jenny landed on the opposite curbing, breathing hard. What was that street? Umpty what? Well, it didn't matter anyway. She hadn't the nickel for car fare. What did you do next? You begged from people on the street? Jenny selected a middle-aged, prosperous, motherly-looking woman. She framed her plea with stiff lips. Before she had finished her sentence, she found herself addressing empty air. The middle-aged, prosperous, motherly-looking woman had hurried on. Well, then you tried a man. You had to be careful there. He mustn't be the wrong kind. There were so many wrong kinds. Just an ordinary-looking family man would be best. Ordinary-looking family men are strangely in the minority. There are so many more bull-necked, tan-shoed ones. Finally, Jenny's eye, grown sharp with want, saw one. Not too well-dressed, kind-faced, middle-aged. She fell into step beside him. "Please, can you help me out with a shilling?" Jenny's nose was red and her eyes watery. Said the middle-aged family man with the kindly face, "Beat it. You've had about enough, I guess." Jenny walked into a department store, picked out the oldest and most stationary-looking floor walker, and put it to him. The floor walker bent his head, caught the word food, swung about, and pointed over Jenny's head. "Grocery department on the 7th floor. Take one of those elevators up." Any one but a floor walker could have seen the misery in Jenny's face. But to floor walkers, all women's faces are horrible. Jenny turned and walked blindly toward the elevators. There was no fight left in her. If the floor walker had said, "Silk negligees on the 4th floor, take one of those elevators up," Jenny would have ridden up to the 4th floor and stupidly gazed at pink silk and val-lace negligees in glass cases. Tell me, have you ever visited the grocery department of a great store on the wrong side of State Street? It's a mouth-watering experience. A department store grocery is a glorified mixture of delicatessen shop, meat market, and vaudeville. Starting with the live lobsters and crabs, you work your hungry way right around past the cheeses and the sausages and the hams and tongues and head cheese, past the blonde person in white who makes marvelous and uneatable things out of gelatin, through 1,000 smells and scents, smells of things smoked and pickled and spiced and baked and preserved and roasted. Jenny stepped out of the elevator, licking her lips. She sniffed the air eagerly as a hound sniffs the scent. She shut her eyes when she passed the sugar-cured hams. A woman was buying a slice from one, and the butcher was extolling its merits. Jenny caught the words juicy and corn-fed. That particular store prides itself on its cheese department. It boasts that there one can get anything in cheese from the simple cottage variety to imposing mottled Stilton. There are cheeses from France, cheeses from Switzerland, cheeses from Holland. Brick and Parmesan, Edam and Limburger perfumed the atmosphere. Behind the counters were big, full-fed men in white aprons and coats. They flourished keen, bright knives. As Jenny gazed, one of them, in a moment of idleness, cut a tiny wedge from a rich yellow Swiss cheese and stood nibbling it absently, his eyes wandering toward the blonde gelatin demonstrator. Jenny swayed and caught the counter. She felt horribly faint and queer. She shut her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, a woman, a fat, housewifely, comfortable-looking woman, was standing before the cheese counter. She spoke to the cheeseman. Once more his sharp knife descended, and he was offering the possible customer a sample. She picked it off the knife's sharp tip, nibbled thoughtfully, shook her head, and passed on. A great, glorious world of hope opened out before Jenny. Her cheeks grew hot, and her eyes felt dry and bright as she approached the cheese counter. "A bit of that," she said, pointing. "It doesn't look just as I like it." "Very fine, madam," the man assured her, and turned the knife point toward her with the infinitesimal wedge of cheese reposing on its blade. Jenny tried to keep her hand steady as she delicately picked it off, nibbled as she had seen that other woman do it, her head on one side, before it shook a slow negative. The effort necessary to keep from cramming the entire piece into her mouth at once left her weak and trembling. She passed on as the other woman had done, around the corner and into a world of sausages. Great rosy mounds of them filled counters and cases. Sausage! Sneer, you pâté de foie gras, but may you know the day when hunger will have you. And on that day may you run into linked temptation in the form of Braunschweiger Metwurst. May you know the longing that causes the eyes to glaze at the sight of Thüringer sausage, and the mouth to water at the scent of Kervelat Wurst, and the fingers to tremble at the nearness of smoked liver. Jenny stumbled on through the smells and the sights. That nibble of cheese had been like a drop of human blood to a man-eating tiger. It made her bold, cunning, even while it maddened. She stopped at this counter and demanded a slice of summer sausage. It was paper thin, but delicious beyond belief. At the next counter there was corned beef, streaked fat and lean. Jenny longed to bury her teeth in the succulent meat and get one great, soul-satisfying mouthful. She had to be content with her judicious nibbling. To pass the golden brown breaded pig's feet was torture. To look at the codfish balls was agony. And so Jenny went on, sampling, tasting the scraps of food, acting only as an aggravation. Up one aisle and down the next she went, and then just around the corner she brought up before the grocery department's pride and boast, the Scotch Bakery. It is the store's star vaudeville feature. All day long the gaping crowd stand before it, watching David the Scone Man, as with sleeves rolled high above his big arms he kneads and slaps and molds and thumps and shapes the dough into toothsome Scotch confections. There was a crowd around the white counters now, and the flat baking surface of the gas stove was just hot enough, and David the Scone Man, he called them scones, was whipping about here and there, turning the baking oat cakes, filling the shelf above the stove when they were done to a turn, rolling out fresh ones, waiting on customers. His nutcracker face almost allowed itself a pleased expression, but not quite. David the Scone Man was Scotch. I was going to add, do ye ken, but I will not. Jenny wondered if she really saw those things. Mutton pies, scones, Scotch shortbread, oat cakes. She edged closer, wriggling her way through the little crowd until she stood at the counter's edge. David the Scone Man, his back to the crowd, was turning the last batch of oat cakes. Jenny felt strangely light-headed and unsteady and airy. She stared straight ahead, a half-smile on her lips, while a hand that she knew was her own, and that yet seemed no part of her, stole out very, very slowly and cunningly and extracted a hot scone from the pile that lay in the tray on the counter. That hand began to steal back, more quickly now, but not quickly enough. Another hand grasped her wrist. A woman's high, shrill voice, "Why will women do these things to each other?" said excitedly,
"Say, Scone Man, this girl is stealing something!" A buzz of exclamations from the crowd. A closing in upon her. A whirl of faces, and counter, and trays, and gas stove. Jenny dropped with a crash, the warm scone still grasped in her fingers. Just before the ambulance came, it was the blonde lady of the impossible gelatins who caught the murmur that came from Jenny's white lips. The blonde lady bent her head closer, closer still. When she raised her face to those other faces crowded near, her eyes were round with surprise. "So far as I can make out, she says her name's Mamie, and she's from Cuba. Wow, wouldn't that eat you? I always thought they were dark-complected." End of Story 7. Maymays from Cuba. Recording by Madeira. Story 8. The Leading Lady of Buttered Side Down. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Madeira. Buttered Side Down by Edna Ferber. Story 8. The Leading Lady. The leading lady lay on her bed and wept, not as you have seen leading ladies weep, becomingly, with eyebrows pathetically V-shaped, mouth quivering, sequined bosom heaving. The leading lady lay on her bed in a red and blue striped kimono and wept as a woman weeps, her head burrowing into the depths of the lumpy hotel pillow, her teeth biting the pillowcase to choke back the sound so that the grouch in the next room might not hear. Presently the leading lady's right hand began to grope about on the bedspread for her handkerchief. Failing to find it, she sat up wearily, raising herself on one elbow and pushing her hair back from her forehead. Not as you have seen a leading lady pass a lily hand across her alabaster brow, but as a heartsick woman does it. Her tears and sniffles had formed a little oasis of moisture on the pillow's white bosom, so that the ugly stripe of the ticking showed through. She gazed down at the damp circle with smarting, swollen eyes, and another lump came up into her throat. Then she sat up resolutely and looked about her. The leading lady had a large and saving sense of humor, but there is nothing that blunts the sense of humor more quickly than a few months of one-night stands. Even O. Henry could have seen nothing funny about that room. The bed was of green enamel, with fly-specked gold trimmings. It looked like a huge frog. The wallpaper was a crime. It represented an army of tan mustard plasters climbing up a chocolate fudge wall. The leading lady was conscious of a feeling of nausea as she gazed at it, so she got up and walked to the window. The room faced west, and the hot afternoon sun smote full on her poor, swollen eyes. Across the street the red brick walls of the engine house caught the glare and sent it back. The firemen, in their blue shirt sleeves, were seated in the shade before the door, their chairs tipped at an angle of 60. The leading lady stared down into the sun-baked street, turned abruptly, and made as though to fall upon the bed again, with a view to forming another little damp oasis on the pillow. But when she reached the center of the stifling little bedroom, her eye chanced on the electric call button near the door. Above the electric bell was tacked a printed placard giving information on the subjects of laundry, ice water, bellboys, and dining room hours. The leading lady stood staring at it a moment thoughtfully. Then with a sudden, swift movement she applied her forefinger to the button and held it there for a long half-minute. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, her kimono folded about her, and waited. She waited until a lank bellboy, in a brown uniform that was some sizes too small for him, had ceased to take any interest in the game of chess which Bauer and Merkel, the champion firemen chess players, were contesting on the walk before the open doorway of the engine house. The proprietor of the Burke House had originally intended that the brown uniform be worn by a diminutive bellboy, such as one sees in musical comedies. But the available supply of stage-size bellboys in our town is somewhat limited, and was soon exhausted. There followed a succession of lank bellboys, with arms and legs sticking ungracefully out of sleeves and trousers. "Come!" called the leading lady quickly, in answer to the lank youth's footsteps, and before he had time to knock. "Ring?" asked the boy, stepping into the torrid little room. The leading lady did not reply immediately. She swallowed something in her throat and pushed back the hair from her moist forehead again. The brown uniform repeated his question, a trifle irritably, whereupon the leading lady spoke, desperately. "Is there a woman about this place? I don't mean dining room girls, or the person behind the cigar counter." Since falling heir to the brown uniform, the lank youth had heard some strange requests. He had been interviewed by various ladies in varicolored kimonos relative to liquid refreshment, laundry, and the cost of hiring a horse and rig for a couple of hours. One had even summoned him to ask if there was a Bible in the house, but this latest question was a new one. He stared, leaning against the door and thrusting one hand into the depths of his very tight breeches pocket.
"Why, there's Pearlie Schultz,"
he said at last, with a grin.
"Who's she?"
The leading lady sat up expectantly.
"Steno."
The expectant figure drooped.
"Blonde, and Irish crochet collar with a black velvet bow on her chest?"
Who, Pearlie? Nah. You mustn't get Pearlie mixed up with the common or garden variety of stenos. Pearlie is fat, and she wears specs, and she's got a double chin. Her hair's skimpy, and she don't wear no rat. Why, no traveling man has ever tried to flirt with Pearlie yet. Pearlie's what you'd call a woman, all right. You wouldn't never make a mistake and think she'd escape from the first row in the chorus.
The leading lady rose from the bed, reached out for her pocketbook, extracted a dime, and held it out to the bellboy.
"Here. Will you ask her to come up here to me? Tell her I said please."
After he had gone, she seated herself on the edge of the bed again, with a look in her eyes like that which you have seen in the eyes of a dog that is waiting for a door to be opened. 15 minutes passed. The look in the eyes of the leading lady began to fade. Then a footstep sounded down the hall. The leading lady cocked her head to watch it, and smiled blissfully. It was a heavy, comfortable footstep, under which a board or two creaked. There came a big, sensible thump, thump, thump at the door, with stout knuckles. The leading lady flew to answer it. She flung the door wide and stood there, clutching her kimono at the throat and looking up into a red, good-natured face. Pearlie Schultz looked down at the leading lady kindly and benignantly, as a mastiff might look at a terrier.
"Lonesome for a bosom to cry on?"
asked she, and stepped into the room, walked to the west windows, and jerked down the shades with a zip-zip, shutting off the yellow glare. She came back to where the leading lady was standing and patted her on the cheek lightly.
"You tell me all about it,"
she said, smiling. The leading lady opened her lips, gulped, tried again, gulped again. Pearlie Schultz shook a sympathetic head.
"Ain't had a decent, close-to-nature powwow with a woman for weeks and weeks, have you?" "How did you know?"
cried the leading lady.
"You've got that hungry look. There was a lady drummer here last winter, and she had the same expression. She was so dead sick of eating her supper and then going up to her ugly room and reading and sewing all evening that it was a wonder she'd stayed good. She said it was easy enough for the men. They could smoke and play pool and go to a show and talk to any one that looked good to 'em, but if she tried to amuse herself everybody'd say she was tough. She cottoned to me like a burr to a wool skirt. She traveled for a perfumery house, and she said she hadn't talked to a woman except the dry goods clerks, who were nice to her trying to work her for perfume samples for weeks and weeks. Why, that woman made crochet by the bolt, and mended her clothes evenings, whether they needed it or not, and read till her eyes come near going back on her."
The leading lady seized Pearlie's hand and squeezed it.
"That's it. Why, I haven't really talked to a real woman since the company went out on the road. I'm leading lady of the Second Wife Company, you know. It's one of those small cast plays with only 5 people in it. I play the wife, and I'm the only woman in the cast. It's terrible. I ought to be thankful to get the part these days, and I was, too, but I didn't know it would be like this. I'm going crazy. The men in the company are good kids, but I can't go trailing around after them all day. Besides, it wouldn't be right. They're all married, except Billy, who plays the kid, and he's busy writing a vaudeville skit that he thinks the New York managers are going to fight for when he gets home. We were to play Athens, Wisconsin tonight, but the house burned down night before last, and that left us with an open date. When I heard the news, you'd have thought I'd lost my mother. It's bad enough having a whole day to kill, but when I think of tonight—"
The leading lady's voice took on a note of hysteria.
"It seems as though I'd say,"
Pearlie interrupted abruptly,
"you ain't got a real good corset cover pattern, have you? One that fits smooth over the bust and don't slip off the shoulders? I don't seem to be able to get my hands on the kind I want." "Have I?"
yelled the leading lady, and made a flying leap from the bed to the floor. She flapped back the cover of a big suitcase and began burrowing into its depths, strewing the floor with lingerie, newspaper clippings, blouses, photographs, and Dutch collars. Pearlie came over and sat down on the floor in the midst of the litter. The leading lady dived once more, fished about in the bottom of the suitcase, and brought a crumpled piece of paper triumphantly to the surface.
This is it. It only takes 1 yard and 5/8 and fits like Anna held skirts. Comes down in a V front and back, like this, see? And no fullness. Wait a minute. I'll show you my princess slip. I made it all by hand, too. I'll bet you couldn't buy it under $15, and it cost me $4.80, with the lace and all.
Before an hour had passed, the leading lady had displayed all her treasures, from the photograph of her baby that died to her new Blanche ring curl cluster, and was calling Pearlie by her first name. When a bell somewhere boomed 6 o'clock, Pearlie was being instructed in a new exercise calculated to reduce the hips an inch a month.
My land!
cried Pearlie, aghast, and scrambled to her feet as nimbly as any woman can who weighs 200 pounds.
Supper time, and I've got a bunch of letters an inch thick to get out. I'd better reduce that some before I begin on my hips. But say, I've had a lovely time.
The leading lady clung to her.
You've saved my life. Why, I forgot all about being hot and lonely and a couple of 1,000 miles from New York. Must you go? Got to, but if you'll promise you won't laugh, I'll make a date for this evening that'll give you a new sensation anyway. There's going to be a strawberry social on the lawn of the parsonage of our church. I've got a booth. You shed that kimono and put on a thin dress and those curls and some powder, and I'll introduce you as my friend, Miss Evans. You don't look Evans, but this is a Methodist Church strawberry festival, and if I was to tell them that you are leading lady of the Second Wife Company, they'd excommunicate my booth. A strawberry social? Gasped the leading lady. Do they still have them?
She did not laugh.
Why, I used to go to strawberry festivals when I was a little girl, and careful, you'll be giving away your age, and anyway, you don't look it. Fashions and strawberry socials ain't changed much. Better bathe your eyes in eau de cologne or whatever it is they're always dabbing on 'em in books. See you at 8.
At 8 o'clock, Pearlie's thump-thump sounded again, and the leading lady sprang to the door as before. Pearlie stared. This was no tear-stained, heat-bedraggled creature in an unbecoming red-striped kimono. It was a remarkably pretty woman in a white lingerie gown over a pink slip. The leading lady knew a thing or two about the gentle art of making up.
That just goes to show, remarked Pearlie, that you must never judge a woman in a kimono or bathing suit. You look 19. Say, I forgot something downstairs. Just get your handkerchief and chamois together and meet me in my cubbyhole next to the lobby, will you? I'll be ready for you.
Downstairs she summoned the lank bellboy.
You go outside and tell Sid Strang I want to see him, will you? He's on the bench with the baseball bunch.
Pearlie had not seen Sid Strang outside. She did not need to. She knew he was there. In our town all the young men dress up in their pale gray suits and lavender striped shirts after supper on summer evenings. Then they stroll down to the Burke House, buy a cigar, and sit down on the benches in front of the hotel to talk baseball and watch the girls go by. It is astonishing to note the number of our girls who have letters to mail after supper. One would think that they must drive their pens fiercely all the afternoon in order to get out such a mass of correspondence. The obedient Sid reached the door of Pearlie's little office just off the lobby as the leading lady came down the stairs with a spangled scarf trailing over her arm. It was an effective entrance.
Why, hello, said Pearlie, looking up from her typewriter as though Sid Strang were the last person in the world she expected to see. What do you want here? Ethel, this is my friend, Mr. Sid Strang, one of our rising young lawyers. His neckties always match his socks. Sid, this is my friend, Miss Ethel Evans of New York. We're going over to the strawberry social at the M.E. parsonage. Don't suppose you care about going?
Mr. Sid Strang gazed at the leading lady in the white lingerie dress with the pink slip and the V-shaped neck and the spangled scarf, and turned to Pearlie.
Why, Pearlie Schultz, he said reproachfully. How can you ask? You know what a strawberry social means to me. I haven't missed one in years. I know it, replied Pearlie with a grin. You feel the same way about Thursday evening prayer meeting, too, don't you? You can walk over with us if you want to. We're going now. Miss Evans and I have got a booth.
Sid walked. Pearlie led them determinedly past the rows of gray suits and lavender and pink shirts on the benches in front of the hotel. And as the leading lady came into view, the gray suits stopped talking baseball and sat up and took notice. Pearlie had known all of those young men inside of the swagger suits in the days when their summer costume consisted of a pair of Dad's pants cut down to a doubtful fit and a nondescript shirt damp from the swimming hole. So she called out cheerily, "We're going over to the Strawberry Festival. I expect to see all you boys there to contribute your mite to the church carpet." The leading lady turned to look at them and smiled. They were such a dapper, pink-cheeked, clean-looking lot of boys, she thought. At that the benches rose to a man and announced that they might as well stroll over right now. Whenever a new girl comes to visit in our town, our boys make a concerted rush at her and develop a case immediately, and the girl goes home when her visit is over with her head swimming and forever after bores the girls of her home town with tales of her conquests. The ladies of the First M.E. Church still talk of the money they garnered at the Strawberry Festival. Pearlie's out-of-town friend was garnerer-in-chief. You take a cross-eyed, pock-marked girl and put her in a white dress with a pink slip on a green lawn under a string of rose-colored Japanese lanterns, and she'll develop an almost oriental beauty. It is an ideal setting. The leading lady was not cross-eyed or pock-marked. She stood at the lantern-illumined booth with Pearlie in the background and dispensed an unbelievable amount of strawberries. Sid Strang and the hotel bench brigade assisted. They made engagements to take Pearlie and her friend down river next day, and to the ball game, and planned innumerable picnics, gazing meanwhile into the leading lady's eyes. There grew in the cheeks of the leading lady a flush that was not brought about by the pink slip, or the Japanese lanterns, or the skillful application of rouge. By 9 o'clock the strawberry supply was exhausted, and the president of the Foreign Missionary Society was sending wildly downtown for more ice cream.
"I call it an outrage," puffed Pearlie happily, ladling ice cream like mad. "Making a poor working girl like me slave all evening. How many was that last order? 4? My land, that's the 3rd dish of ice cream Ed White's had. You'll have something to tell the villagers about when you get back to New York."
The leading lady turned a flushed face toward Pearlie.
"This is more fun than the Actors' Fair. I had the photograph booth last year, and I took in nearly as much as Lil Russell, and goodness knows all she needs to do at a fair is to wear her diamond and pearl stomacher and her set-piece smile, and the men just swarm around her like the pictures of a crowd in a McCutcheon cartoon."
When the last Japanese lantern had guttered out, Pearlie Schultz and the leading lady prepared to go home. Before they left, the M.E. ladies came over to Pearlie's booth and personally congratulated the leading lady and thanked her for the interest she had taken in the cause, and the secretary of the Epworth League asked her to come to the tea that was to be held at her home the following Tuesday. The leading lady thanked her and said she'd come if she could. Escorted by a bodyguard of gray suits and lavender-striped shirts, Pearlie and her friend, Miss Evans, walked toward the hotel. The attentive bodyguard confessed itself puzzled. "Aren't you staying at Pearlie's house?" asked Sid tenderly when they reached the Burke house. The leading lady glanced up at the windows of the stifling little room that faced west. "No," answered she, and paused at the foot of the steps to the ladies' entrance. The light from the electric globe over the doorway shone on her hair and sparkled in the folds of her spangled scarf. "I'm not staying at Pearlie's because my name isn't Ethel Evans. It's Amy Fox, with a little French accent mark over the double E. I'm leading lady of the Second Wife Company, and old enough to be, well, your auntie anyway. We go out at 1:30 tomorrow morning." End of Story 8. The Leading Lady. Recording by Madera.